Hello guys, and welcome back to the first episode of the Beginner's Guide to the Australian Power Sector. Now this video will provide a high level of the Australian power sector, mainly focusing on the broad level structure and how it's operated by the key system stakeholder, whose job is essentially to keep the entire country's power system running so we can have that coveted access to power at our walls, which we definitely as a society take for granted. Now, if you missed this series overview I posted prior, feel free to jump back to it now. But as a preface to that video, essentially what I went over was what this series is going to detail, the perfect audience for this series, and exactly what you can expect going forward. But to summarize it, if you are a young professional looking to get a taste of what the power sector in Australia is like and what potential careers you can find in it going forward, this is the perfect series for you. So yeah, no better time than the present, so let's get into the presentation. So we are now over on our presentation. So as I said before, today's presentation is going to focus exactly on the power sector overview in Australia, with the hopes to kind of give you guys an overarching perspective on how the power sector is operated and the different infrastructure involved. We're not going to go into that infrastructure in detail today. That will come in the future transmission, generation, distribution videos, but we're going to go over it as a high level, which you'll see in a sec. Righty, so today's video will be structured into three different parts. So the first one, we're going to be looking at how the power sector is structured from a top-down level. The second, we're going to look at the key stakeholders involved, both in operating and kind of regulating the power sector here. And the third level, we're going to look at how these stakeholders interact to ensure this kind of harmonious operation that is the power sector. Now, Australia's power landscape is, as we can see here. So if you haven't seen a map with all the power lines or the roads on it before, it kind of looks like blood vessels, but I can promise you they represent power lines, and the different colors represent different voltage levels. So without getting too much into it, each color represents a different kind of voltage, and a voltage is used differently in different states. So as you can see from the diagram, although they are different colors, they're all interconnected, and that's really done to promote the reliability of the transmission network. So for example, say one state has no generation at a certain time, say for example South Australia that relies on lots of solar during the middle of the day. Say the sun's not out that day, it can rely on its interconnectors with Melbourne to supply that sort of electricity until the sun comes out, for example. But that sort of reliability is why they're interconnected. So as you can see, the transmission lines range from down Cairns down the east coast down to Tasmania, and then up across to South Australia. But what you will notice is there's a disconnect between South Australia and Western Australia, and that's mostly because it's not very populated across this kind of Great Australian Bight area. And then the Western Australia type is what's called the Southwest Interconnected System, or the SWIS, and there's a big interconnected network down there. But what you will notice is that these splits are actually called what we like to call the NEM, which is the interconnected down the eastern side, and the WEM, which is the Western Australia Southwest Interconnected System Network. But you're probably thinking, what in the heck does NEM and WEM mean? And that's a great question, which I will get to in a sec. But essentially the NEM, if I go back, is from Cairns down to SA with a link across to Tasmania. And the WEM is essentially just Western Australia. Okay, so NEM and WEM, what do they mean? Let's start with the NEM, huh? So the NEM stands for the National Electricity Market. And as I said before, interconnects essentially 5 different states. So Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia. And also in there as well is the Australian Capital Territory. So lines run into there as well. Now, this interconnected system is one of the largest in the world, spanning around 40,000 kilometers of transmission line. But this is considered one of both the longest and sparsest. So if you think about Australia, we're a very distributed population, meaning that people live in that middle sort of Australia, but it's not very dense. So to distribute power into those areas, it's very long lines, and to build sort of reliability for that, you've got to build 2, so they build to n-1 reliability, meaning that if one fails, one can pick up the slack. But the resultant of that is that it's very expensive to do so. So although we have a very long network, it may not be as reliable in those kind of remote regions. Now, the NEM supplies 175 terawatt hours of annual energy, which is a lot. So that's 10 to the 12, I believe. Billion, trillion, tera. Yep, that's right. So 10 to the 12 watt hours, which is huge, to 9 million customers, being both residential and commercial. A customer is defined as essentially a house would be a customer. So one single house, not everyone that lives in that house, but a customer is essentially a point where we supply you electricity. Now, a key definition of the NEM is a wholesale market style. Now, to give you an overview of essentially what a wholesale market style is essentially a spot market, which works if we assume one side is the generator and one side is essentially the demand or market operator. So the generator will say to the market operator, okay, we've got capacity to generate this amount of energy at this time. So it works in 5-minute intervals. So say at 9 o'clock, they say, okay, from 9 o'clock to 9:05, we can generate this amount of energy. The market operator then comes back and says, okay, you can generate this amount. We've got enough demand for that. We're going to pay you this because we've got a lot of competitors in the market. They basically say, yep. And then they supply that for the next 5 minutes. And then the next 5 minutes, it happens again and again and again. And prices fluctuate depending on how many generators are on the market, so that's supply, and also how much demand is in the network. So for example, peak demand may be in the afternoons when everyone gets home from work and cranks up their air cons and stuff like that. And say peak supply for a solar generator might be in the middle of the day when the sun's out. So that's kind of a high level of how the wholesale market works. Now, the NEM utilizes both private and state-owned assets. So privately owned means that they are private companies, and state-owned means that they are owned by the state government. So the NEM also actually has a live data dashboard, which is awesome to look at. So I'm going to jump onto there real quick and show you around what the price looks like, as well as you can see all the generation profiles. So let's jump into that. So we are on the NEM data dashboard at the moment, as you can see from up the top. So this is on the AEMO website. I will leave a link in the description for both this one and the WEM. But essentially, if you go to the AEMO website and look up NEM data dashboard, you'll get there. This dashboard's pretty good, and it gives you a lot of insight into how the market works. So just to further explain the wholesale style market. So as you can see here, the 5 interconnected states and all their prices. So a bit of a deep dive. As I said before, the spot price is essentially dependent on demand versus generation. So, but you'll say, Jack, why for Queensland, why is generation higher than demand, but the price is still nearly $100 per megawatt hour? Whereas for South Australia, the demand is higher than the generation, but it's negative. And usually I would say, great question. However, there is an explanation. So Queensland, basically, because they know there's going to be a lot of demand, they schedule in a lot of generation. And the problem with this scheduling generation is it's all the firm generation, like gas-powered power plants, coal-fired generation, which is very expensive. Whereas South Australia is getting a lot of generation from wind at the moment, and although it looks sunny outside today, I can promise you it's not. So they can't be getting solar, but it is windy here. So there's a lot of wind going out, and that's why our wind is cheap, so that's why our price is negative. What you can also see here is the flow between the states. So at the moment, because there's more generation than demand in Queensland, they're sending a lot to New South, which is then sending a lot to Vic, which is helping Tasmania. So that's the advantage of an interconnected network. You know, power can flow through interconnectors to help other states, which their generation mix may not be the best. So if we move into graphical representations of this, we can see South Australia. So this is demand and price. So you can see this is what they call the duck curve, which is awesome. So it actually goes negative during the middle of the day, and that's because of so much rooftop solar. So that's why the grid is kind of augmenting, and that's the energy transition that we have to account for. But Tasmania, and okay, so if we go over to fuel mix, so this is essentially, we're using the NEM tab. So as you can see here, 40% of the demand in the NEM is still supplied by black coal, which is something we want to get away from with this sort of climate change pressure. But the good sign is 22% is solar, 18% is wind, which is awesome. So another breakdown here. And then renewable penetration. So essentially the maximum renewable penetration ever recorded. So this is the amount of renewable energy able to supply the, I guess, entire system load at any point in time. So the most we've ever got is 72%, which is pretty good. And then the rest of this is just data and 7-day outlook, which if you're into models and stuff like that, is a great place for it. But that basically summarizes the NEM. So we've had the NEM, now we're moving into the WEM, which is the wholesale electricity market. So the wholesale electricity market, as I said before, is essentially Western Australia's version of the NEM, but mainly that southwestern interconnected system. So right, that bottom western cordon of Australia. So contrastingly to the NEM, which was 40,000 kilometers of transmission line, the WEM is only 7,750, but they do have a lot of distribution lines. So much less energy generated, only about 20 terawatt hours, which keep in mind is still a huge amount of energy, supplied to around 1 million customers, both residential and commercial. And as I said before, the WEM essentially supplies the Southwest Interconnected System, or SWIS. Now, contrastingly to the wholesale style market that is normal to the NEM, the WEM employs a combination of two kind of market styles, where they have something that's called a RCM, or Reserve Capacity Mechanism, as well as a short-term energy market. Now, this is pretty effective. So essentially what the Reserve Capacity Mechanism is, they will pay upfront to generators 48 hours in advance. The generator will come to them and say, okay, on this date, we can generate this amount. They will get given a capacity credit, which then they can redeem at that time to generate that amount. What the short-term energy market is kind of the same, but on a shorter time frame. So the RCM portion of the market is very characteristic of your firm generation. So for example, your coal-fired power plants of the past, your gas-fired turbines, etc., etc. That real firm generation that can ramp up and ramp down as required. Now, the STEM market is really geared toward your renewable generation and also your batteries. So in the short term, if a battery is charged, it can register to discharge at whenever the grid needs it, and then it'll discharge. The same thing with solar. If it's going to be a sunny day, they can register and expel their solar during the day. So that's kind of how the two market styles interact into the common WEM market, which is characteristically known to be able to essentially supply demand at lower prices, contrastingly to the NEM. Now, where the NEM was a combination of state and privately owned, the WEM is entirely state-owned. So the Western Australian government commissions basically 2 different companies to control distribution, generation, and transmission. This also has a live data dashboard. So I'm going to jump into that real quick and show you around. So the wholesale electricity market isn't as flashy of a dashboard as the NEM, but what it does provide is a good representation of how the market works. So what you guys can see here is essentially the total demand at any one time in the WEM. So what you can see here, if I zoom in a touch, so what the darker green is essentially the RCM. So that's the stuff scheduled a lot in advance. So they obviously have pretty good forecasts. So they know essentially what the demand is going to be. So they can schedule that in ahead of time. And then the light green at the bottom is the short-term energy market. And it's essentially the gap between what they've previously scheduled and what the demand actually is supplied by the short-term energy market. So the WEM actually has a pretty efficient way of supplying their capacity. And yeah, it's a pretty cool network actually. Going over into generation. So this essentially shows where and what type of generation is currently on the market. You can see Alinta is supplying, so these are different retailers. So Alinta 526 megawatts, Synergy is 505, Blue Waters is 208, and then all these smaller ones. And then you can filter down into what type. So there's lots of wind in the WEM, so as you can see here, pretty cool dynamic of it. DPV, which is distributed photovoltaics. So this is essentially all your rooftop solar. You'll be able to see here what is, I guess, being generated by DPV during the day. Facilities, which I assume, yeah, big coal and gas power plants. And then DER, which is distributed energy resources, so things like your household batteries. I think also rooftop solar is counted toward this, but yeah, that's DER. The clearing price, so this is essentially the same price as what's on the NEM, but this is the Western Australian version. So as you can see, pretty low. And then this is essentially the gas network records weekly. But yeah, the cool stuff here is the generation and market pulse. So again, if you want to have a look, I'll chuck the link in the description. Feel free to have a play around, but that summarizes the WEM. Okay, so we've gone over the overall key infrastructure in Australia. Now let's get into the stakeholders that make this actually operate. So when we're looking at any sort of power sector across the world, essentially you will have 2 key stakeholders, or 3, but they will fit into these 2 categories. So you'll have a regulatory body, which essentially monitors performance and compliance with the rules, and you'll have a market operator, which essentially manages the day-to-day market operation. All right, so let's first define our key stakeholders before we get into the roles and responsibilities here. So in the NEM, there are 2 regulatory bodies, the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission. And there is only one market operator, being AEMO, or the Australian Energy Market Operator. So how this relationship is kind of structured, so the AEMC provides the rules and regulations that the market must follow, and then the AER essentially enforces those rules and monitors performance. And then essentially what AEMO or the market operator does is basically operates the market. So in the NEM, they set prices, they monitor generation and all that sort of stuff. It's a lot more complicated, but that's a high-level summary of it. Alrighty, moving into the WEM, which is similar but a bit different. So they also have 2 regulatory bodies and 1 market operator. You'll notice that the market operator is actually the same, so that's correct. AEMO is responsible for both operating the NEM and the WEM. However, the regulatory bodies are different. So regulator that makes the rules here is essentially the coordinator of energy. So the head of energy policy in the WA government. So they develop the market rules and essentially the Economic Regulation Authority, or ERA, enforces these rules and makes sure AEMO kind of upholds their performance standards. So it's a bit of a similar situation, but a touch different. So the Australian power system is a very large network, one of the largest in the world. And although that sounds very nice, it comes along with a lot of risk in terms of it's very prone to bushfires and reliability issues. But the market operator and resultant generation, transmission, distribution have gotten very good at counteracting this. So especially in the energy transition, this is going to be a hot topic. We've gone over that there are two key systems, being the NEM and the WEM, the national electricity market and the wholesale electricity market, along with their different stakeholders. So there is two types of stakeholders involved generally with this. There is a regulatory body and a market operator, each with different roles. But overall, they contribute to the successful power system. You know, we've appreciated electricity in Australia for probably over 200, 300 years. And although the operators and regulatory body has evolved, the infrastructure has evolved with it. And we can go to bed every day knowing we're going to wake up to a charged phone. So you can't ask much more in Australia. So now we've got a good understanding of the overview of Australia's power sector. We're going to do more of a drill down into the specific functional areas, which are, as you can see here. So we've got generation, transmission, distribution, the retailers and consumers. So I aim to basically upload one of these videos a week going forward. So by the end of the next 6 weeks, you have this entire series to watch through. If you're keen for that and have enjoyed this video, feel free to let me know your favorite part down below, as well as any questions. I'll be answering them all. But yeah, as I always say, it's a great day to have a great day, so make sure you enjoy yours. I'll see you next week for a video on generation. Have a good one, guys. Thank you so much for watching that video. If you enjoyed it and want to see a similar video on the channel, click right here to see the next video in the playlist. Otherwise, for the latest upload to the channel, click right here. As always, it's a great day to have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next one.